Hello there, listeners. This is an audio recording of my book, The Westwind Tales of Sword and Sand, which is book 1 in the Westwind Tales series. If you like what you hear, consider subscribing, leaving a like or a comment, or preferably all of the above. If you want more content like this, consider supporting the channel by purchasing my book on Amazon, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or, preferably, both. So sit back, relax, grab a cup of tea, and enjoy the chapter. Chapter 8. Du Fürst auf du Thirstach Teegh, the first of the Special Order. Merritt Longstride awoke to a throbbing pain in his head. He slowly sat up and took in his surroundings. The horses were gone, and his saddlebags were lying across his knees, though they had obviously been rifled through and the contents pilfered. Head spinning, he clambered to his feet with a groan. The mage had escaped him. Anger replaced the headache in his head as he remembered what had happened. The mage had not escaped. He had been rescued. Rescued by an Ammer-damned stickhead Olma. Merritt clenched his hands into fists at his sides in an attempt to calm himself. Anger was pointless now. It would not return his captive to him. He had to think. He had to plan. He had been warned by the guild masters not to go head-to-head with an Olma doe using dragon magic. Until now, he had always assumed they were just scared old men, but the events of the day had brutally taught him otherwise. He coughed a bitter laugh. Of course, uncivilized barbarians would end up in control of an ancient well of magic from the most powerful race to ever walk the lands of Jordan. That was irony at its finest. Looking back on it, Merritt was proud, not to mention a little surprised, that he had held his own as long as he had. If he had only been able to control his rage while he was fighting, that mage wouldn't have gotten under his skin so easily. Merritt let out a slow, deliberate breath. Damn bloody rotting. He released another calming breath. He had let his first assignment slip through his fingers because he was too prideful to let an obvious distraction go. His trainers had all told him that his pride was his greatest weakness. But he had ignored them. Hubris, it seemed, wasn't as easy to control as he previously had suspected. Letting out a third, slow breath, Merritt picked up his bag and looked through it. His vials of marrow root extract had been left untouched, along with another of the collars wrapped in cloth. He sighed at his good fortune. These would make the healing process go much faster. Sitting down gingerly at the base of the tree, Merritt crossed his legs and closed his eyes. With a muttered word, his hexacon glowed. Using the guild's spell for introspection, he looked at himself. There were bruises and some internal bleeding. He inhaled and tried to focus. The process would usually take several hours at best, but the marrow root would speed things up greatly. He unstopped one of the vials and swallowed the contents, grimacing as the viscous, overpoweringly sweet liquid slipped easily down his throat. Almost instantly, Merritt felt a surge in his magical capacity. Like a waterfall of strength was pouring into him. Taking a deep breath, he carefully spoke the guild's spell for healing. Magic flowed quickly through the hexacon on his forehead and began spreading into his injured body. Letting his breath out slowly, Merritt let the coursing magic take control. He could feel his body knitting back together in damaged areas. It was a tingly, itchy sort of feeling. Aided by the marrow root, the healing took only a quarter of an hour. By the end of it, Merritt could stand, walk, and run as well as ever. Gathering his things, he slung the saddlebag over his shoulder and set out toward Rockford, figuring that the Olma would take Edmund back into the Witchwood. He had to catch up with them before they were out of his reach. He was brave, but he shuddered at the thought of entering the Witchwood alone, and at night. He had walked along the tree line, back the way he had come, for about an hour, and the sun was below the treetops. It wouldn't be long until it was too dark to continue without a source of light. Unfortunately, 2 of the things Edmund and the Olma had taken from his pack were his flint and tinderbox. The sun sank lower behind the trees, and the shadows, which up until this point had been growing longer and longer with each passing moment, faded into a dusky black before vanishing altogether. Deciding to stop for the night, Merritt walked several paces into the wood and looked for a place to settle in. As he turned this way and that, something caught his attention. In the distance, along the King's Road, was a small fire. Just a dot in the night, but it made his spine tingle. His luck had just turned. Merritt slowly and carefully made his way through the trees toward the light. As he grew closer, he could make out a figure sitting on a log near the fire. Slowing his approach, Merritt repositioned himself so that he was directly behind the slumped silhouette. He had to figure out which one it was. Edmund posed no threat while his magic was still bound by the collar, but the Olma was the real problem. Slipping the saddlebag from his shoulder, he quietly removed the spare collar he had packed and unwrapped it. If he could locate the Olma, all he had to do was to wait until she fell asleep, and then get the collar around her neck. The figure sitting on the log had no antlers. So the Olma must be elsewhere, he thought. As Merritt strained to look past the fire into the darkness, he saw another body wrapped in a blanket and stretched out next to the fire. Merritt couldn't see the person's head, but he concluded that it must be the Olma. Leaving the pack on the ground where he stood, Merritt slowly began to circle around the fire, trying to get closer to the prone figure. Avoiding sticks and dry leaves near his feet, he carefully made his way around the two, until he was crouching about 10 feet behind the sleeping Olma. Merritt settled down quietly onto his knees and waited for the right moment. He couldn't be sure that they were both asleep. Time would tell. The night was just beginning, and he had plenty of time to wait. The figure sitting on the log kept bobbing his head as though he were fighting to stay awake. Merritt breathed a sigh of relief that he had been silent in his movements around the campfire. Edmund had been awake the whole time. Fidgeting with the collar in his hands, Merritt steadied his breathing and waited. The longer he waited there on his knees in the bushes, the more something nagged at the back of his mind. Something was off. Something was wrong. He rubbed the silver collar with his thumbs, careful to keep it below the reach of the firelight. His eyes widened as he realized what was wrong. The collar. He couldn't sense the collar. When Edmund had been close, Merritt could feel the presence of the active collar around his neck. It was a cold, metallic presence that grated against his magic like sandstone. Merritt's gaze shot up to the person slumped on the log on the far side of the campfire. His face and neck were covered in shadow. He was sure that Edmund couldn't have gotten the collar off his neck. Only the one who put it on could remove it. He closed his eyes and reached out with his magic, just enough to try to sense the collar. He could feel the one in his hands, though it was weaker than if it had been active. It was the only one he could feel. He hadn't imagined it. The person on the log bobbed his head again, this time startling himself awake. Merritt's pulse quickened. Either Edmund had found a way to remove the collar, or these two people weren't. His train of thought came to an abrupt halt as he heard voices approach the camp. The person sitting on the log heard them and quickly stood up. This person was much taller than Edmund had been, a little shorter than an Olma, and not as broad. The figure laying just in front of Merritt woke up as well and pushed himself into a sitting position. The light of the fire danced on his face, revealing ashen skin and long, crimson hair, with the tips of pointed ears sticking out from it. Merritt's breath caught in his throat. Mountain elves. Merritt desperately tried to think of what to do. He could hide where he was, and they may not find him. Then he remembered his bag. He had left it on the ground behind the elf who had been sitting. Cursing silently at his stupidity, he could hear the approaching voices grow louder. "Got these two sleeping under the stars out on the King's Road, right under our noses," one of the voices said. "Hey, Gally, wake up. Look what we found." "I'm awake." The elf who had been sleeping in front of Merritt stood up and stretched. "Give me a moment, will you?" He stooped over and opened a bag that was lying near his bedroll and pulled out a small bottle. Unstopping it, Gally brought it to his nose and sniffed it before taking a large gulp. All right." The smell of spiced wine wafted over to Merritt. "What have we got here?" Turning around to face the voices, the elf held up a hand, palm upward, and gave a deep, vibrating hum, the elves' way of using ley magic. A small orb of glowing blue wisp light appeared above his hand, bobbing lazily up and down. Gally walked over, past the other elf, and out of the camp. Merritt let out his breath, which he had been holding. These were mountain elves, yes, but that didn't necessarily mean they were slavers. A group of 5 elves, led by Gally, came marching back into camp. Behind them, being pulled by ropes around their hands, were 2 other elves, one male and one female by their looks, as opposed to the mountain elves who wore their red hair bobbed short at the jaw. These 2 had brown hair down past their shoulders. The group halted once they had entered camp, and the elf with the light above his hand turned around and looked the 2 captives over. "Hand me the ledger, will you, Cobb?" Rummaging through a pack near the fire, the elf produced a leather-bound book and tossed it over. Gally opened the ledger and traced down one of the pages with a finger. Tum-ti-tum-tum. Ah, yes, here we are. He glanced up at the others. "Looks like our employers are in short supply of wood elves down in the Southlands. Seems as though you can't tolerate the sand down there well at all. You keep, expiring." He smiled cruelly and snapped the ledger shut. "Now then, put them with the others. All we have left is that special order to fill, and we can be off. South again for the payoff, lads." The slavers, for there was no doubt in Merritt's mind that they were, cheered and laughed. As they started to drag the 2 wood elves away, the female elf struggled forward and shouted, "Cowards! Selling your own kind! How dare you!" Her voice was cut short and her eyes grew suddenly tense as she clenched her jaw shut. Merritt felt the familiar, cold, metallic presence of an active collar. Gally walked over to her and brought his wisp light close to her face. "What's your name, girl?" The wood elf struggled to remain silent, but Merritt could tell by the strained expression on her face that she was in great pain. Finally, she broke and gasped, "Balsa!" "Well then, Balsa," smiled Gally, "when I sell you in the Southlands, I will instruct your new masters to whip you extra thoroughly when you are disobedient." He seized her jaw in his other hand and yanked her eyes up to his. "And do not be mistaken. You are not my people. During the border wars, your people abandoned mine to be slaughtered at the hands of the Northlanders. My father fought in that war, losing his life protecting the refugees fleeing to the south. You deserted us to save your own skins. And now, for every one of your people I sell into servitude, I feel just a little bit of justice being done in the world." Releasing her face, he motioned to the 4 of his men standing behind her. "Put her with the others, and leave the collar active for the night. Let her squirm." Balsa's face tightened with silent pain as they dragged her out of the light. Cobb, who had returned to his place by the fire, pulled a small flute from one of the packs, lifted his head, and watched them drag the wood elf out of the camp. As soon as they had disappeared from sight, he looked over at Gally and spoke. "Home again, eh, Gally?" Extinguishing his wisp light with a flick of his hand, Gally stared out into the night and answered without looking back. "Aye, home again. It's been what, 10 months? Cobb nodded to himself and began to play a slow, quiet tune on his flute. The notes floated to Merritt's ears. They sounded sad, almost mournful. Gally continued to himself. "That's an awful long time to be away from you, Urza, my heart." He sighed heavily and turned toward the fire. "All this tracking has taken longer than I anticipated. Finding people of different races is easy enough, but searching for specific bloodlines, that is a thing that takes time and work. Lots of hard work. We had better be paid more than last time." When Gally took a step toward the campfire, his foot caught on something in the shadows. He stumbled forward a few steps before spinning around and staring at the ground. He stooped and picked whatever it was up. His back was to Merritt. "Hey, Cobb." Gally turned around and faced the fire. Merritt's blood froze. "This yours?" In his hands was Merritt's saddlebag. Cobb ceased his playing and frowned. "Can't say it is. You think it's Lorne's?" Gally shook his head, bringing the bags up to his nose. "I haven't seen him with it before. Ugh, it reeks of horse." He smelled it again, deeper this time. "There's human scent on this bag." Merritt's head spun. He had been found out. No, not yet, he thought. I can still get away. Gally dropped the saddlebag and drew a dagger from his belt. Cobb lurched to his feet and followed suit. The two of them summoned glowing wisp lights above their hands and turned toward the forest, holding their lights aloft. "That bag wasn't there when Lorne and the others left this afternoon," said Cobb. "Whoever dropped it could still be here." Gally grinned, glancing sideways at Cobb. "Looks like we've got a bonus. Let's split up and find this rudder." They nodded to each other and headed into the woods on either side of Merritt. He held his breath. I could use magic, he thought. No. They were elves. There was no way he was a match for one of them, let alone two. Elves were the strongest magi of all four races, and they made sure, wherever they went, that everyone knew it. It was a matter of pride to them. Merritt let out a slow, deliberate breath and counted. There were 6 mountain elves that he knew of, and 2 of them were looking for him. He needed to form a plan, or he wouldn't make it out of the camp. He had to assume that there were more. Asherite slaver bands usually traveled in groups of 13, in case they ran across a squad of the king's men. Elves were powerful by themselves, but together, in a harmonized circle of 13, not even war-hardened battle magi could stand against them. Merritt had to assume that there were 7 other mountain elves nearby. He took a deep, quiet breath. The 2 elves had made their way past him, were scoring the underbush behind him. It was fortunate that he had hid so close to the forest's edge. They had walked right past him before they even started looking. On all fours, Merritt slowly crept towards the campfire. If he reached his bag, he could use the marrow root. It could give him the edge he needed to face the 2 elves. He stopped where he was and closed his eyes. Hubris, he thought to himself. Think, you fool. He was no match for a single elf. He had to accept that. There was no chance of winning against them, not even with the marrow root. He opened his eyes again and turned to his left. Crawling slowly along the border of the firelight, he made his way out of the wood and away from his saddlebag. He could hear the elves behind him, crashing around in the bushes, looking for him. He grinned to himself. He was going to make it. He had pulled the wool over the eyes of a band of elves and gotten away with it. Then something grabbed his ankle. Merritt felt himself being yanked backward toward the campfire. Clawing at the grassy turf, he desperately tried to fight back, and suddenly he was lifted upside down into the air. He still could not see what was holding him. A low hum filled his ears, vibrating through his chest. Galley and Cobb sauntered out of the tree line. Each wore a smug grin. Looks like we flushed the rabbit out of its bush, eh, Galley? Cobb chuckled. Nodding, Galley approached Merritt. He held his wisp light up, illuminating Merritt's hanging form. Baal's blood, said Galley as the light fell on Merritt's face. He's a weirder. Cobb stepped up next to Galley and gaped at the symbol on Merritt's head. Disbelief had replaced his smug expression. He darted over to where Galley had left the ledger and snatched it up. Opening it, Cobb thumbed quickly through it until he reached the page he was looking for. One weirder, he read aloud, just of age, strong with magic. He looked over at Merritt, surprise laced in his voice. Galley, this is him, the first of the special order. There's only one more on the list. How did we come into such luck? Galley looked doubtful. He was supposed to be traveling with the other. He traced a finger across the hexagon on Merritt's head. We don't know if this really is the one we're looking for. I suppose there's one way to find out. He gave a low hum. Merritt felt the grip on his ankle release. For a moment, he hung in the air before smashing into the ground below him. Shaking his head in a daze, he staggered to his feet, facing the 2 elves. Galley backed off a few paces and called to Merritt. Come on then, weirder. Attack me. I need to see just how strong you are. Merritt, confused and still slightly dazed, gawked at Galley before rushing at him as fast as he could manage, arms outstretched. If he could just catch him off balance. A forceful gust of air, accompanied by a humming from Galley, blew Merritt onto his back. Rolling over onto his side, he coughed as he tried to get up again. Not like that, you half-wit, scolded Galley. Use your guild magic. I need to see if you're the one we're looking for. A voice in the back of Merritt's head told him to play weak. They wouldn't risk going against the Weirding Guild for the wrong person. But he pushed the thought out of his mind. If these elves wanted to see his true strength, then he would show them. He was the strongest vessel of the Weirding Guild. Not even the 5 masters could match his strength. Pushing himself to his knees, Merritt opened himself to the magic of the hexagon, grasping all he could hold. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he locked his gaze on Galley. The hexagon began to glow, brilliant white in the darkness that surrounded him. In a voice of stone, resonating with more magic than he had ever held before, Merritt Longstride spoke the guild's words of power. Dominus, And that's enough of that, said Galley with a wave of his hand. An invisible ironclad wall slammed between Merritt and his magic. shattering his concentration and completely cutting him off. His power emptied from him like water from a broken pitcher, leaving him gasping for air. His legs gave out underneath him and he collapsed to his knees. The mental block squeezed around his mind, and though he railed against it with all his might, it refused to budge. "Well, it's definitely him," said Cobb. "He's the strongest human of his age we've run across, that's for sure." Galley nodded in agreement. "Yes, but where is the other?" He turned to Merritt, who was struggling to reach his magic through the shield that Galley had put in place around him. "Where is the one you were traveling with, boy?" Merritt glared up at Galley from the ground. Grunting, Galley looked over his shoulder at Cobb. "Grab me that collar he was carrying, will you?" Cobb nodded and walked over to where Merritt had dropped it and picked it up. He tossed it over to Galley. "All right, I'll ask you once more, but that's it. After that, what happens is your own fault. You're barely a tenth of my age, and I don't feel like soiling the goods before I'm paid for them. So where is the one you are traveling with?" Merritt clamped his jaw shut sullenly and dropped his gaze to the ground. Galley sighed. "So be it." In one fluid motion, he slipped the collar around Merritt's neck, and with a sickening, metallic click, it locked in place. Like a snake coiling around its prey, the metal circles tightened around his skin. Merritt gasped. The cold metal collar felt wrong. Never before had he been forced to wear one. Galley removed the shield from Merritt's mind with a quiet hum. Merritt jerked out with his mind, scrambling to reach his magic. His grip closed around it, and for a split second, hope sparked in his heart. But pain arced through his body. A metal voice spoke in his mind, hissing like some freakish reptile. "Release!" He threw his magic away from himself. The pain was so unexpected, so horrible, that he fell onto his side, screaming more out of fear and surprise than from the pain itself. Cobb and Galley laughed at him. "He's a weirder, all right," chuckled Cobb. "They don't wear the collars they make for others." "Never felt what it's like before," nodded Galley. "To be utterly cut off from your sense of power, your security. Every weirder I've dealt with reacts the same way. Surprise. Like they don't understand what pain can feel like." He crouched next to Merritt and tapped the hexagon on his forehead. "It's a good thing you didn't activate a guild spell with that tattoo of yours. Then the pain wouldn't have ended until we removed the collar. Which, well, we wouldn't have." In spite of himself, Merritt whimpered. The look on Galley's face held no pity, no remorse, no shame. In that moment, Merritt understood that he was no longer a free man. The collar seemed to tighten even further around his neck as Galley laughed again, a cold, merciless laugh that chilled Merritt to the bones. Cobb came up behind Galley and put a hand on his shoulder. "It's time that we have a chat about your traveling companion, weirder." Merritt shivered. Well, that wraps up part 1. Make sure you tune in for part 2 later this week. And in the meantime, leave a comment and a like. If you can't wait for part 2, then you can head on over to Amazon and purchase the full-length book there. Or you can click on the link down below. I'll see you all next time, but until then, enjoy the adventure.